Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and this is going to be a really fun video lesson covering basic security concepts for the SSCP certification exam. Up first, the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You'll see these terms throughout these lessons and plenty on your SSCP certification exam, as well as the real world. Now, the CIA Triad is decades old, and in the last few years, we've started to throw in some other security concepts that aren't really covered by the Triad: privacy and authenticity. So I'll dedicate a few slides to those concepts as well. Up first, confidentiality. Well, I think we all inherently know what confidentiality is because it's a common word. You just decide who can access data. It doesn't mean that data is completely protected and nobody can see it. That would just be destruction, right? But it's selectively allowing authorized users to see data and nobody else. So how do we enforce confidentiality? And the typical ways in the real world are file permissions. You put an access control list on your file server, and the file server doesn't give the file to people who aren't on the access control list. Easy. Encryption, which uses cryptographic math to make what looks like a standard text file into a bunch of random stuff unless you have that decryption key. So to enforce confidentiality with encryption, you basically control access to the decryption key. Isolation is another way to enforce confidentiality. If you have some paperwork that's confidential, put it in a locked drawer. You're physically isolating it from somebody else. In military networks, they often make a completely isolated network with no outside connections, including to the internet, and they can store their files on there. So if you want access to it, well, you better bring a computer and plug it right into that network because it's physically isolated from the rest of the world. And finally, we enforce confidentiality through secrecy. You might have information in your head, but you've been trained not to tell it to other people. You're just keeping a secret. So let's look at what happens when confidentiality is compromised. This is a real case that was in the news recently. This very famous and fairly wealthy poker star had his Hotmail account hacked by somebody who was in the poker community. The hacker seemed to know a lot of people in the poker community and therefore was able to suss out some personal information. And I'm going to go out on a limb that his password wasn't that hard to guess. The hacker found out his email address, probably exchanged messages with him, maybe wrote to him as a fan or something, got his email address, and then, maybe found out his dog's name or his wife's birthday or whatever bit of information made up his password. Then they got into his Hotmail account. And you know what they did then? They started poking through his emails. And it turns out this gentleman had sent some compromising photos of himself to some lady friends. And the hackers figured that he probably wouldn't want his peers, other poker players, to see these rather embarrassing photos of him. So they threatened to publish these photos on the internet and to send them to his mom and dad and everybody that he knew and loved and maybe wouldn't want to see those photos. And they knew he was a rich guy, so they asked him for $100,000. Well, actually, these hackers weren't especially good criminals, and they kept changing their numbers. At one point, they asked for like 20K, and then at some point, they asked for $1 million. The news story is all over the place, and it's just because these weren't professional mafia people. These were low-rate hackers who hadn't ever committed a crime before, at least as far as I could tell. So the poker star refused to pay the $100K, and they just published the photos. They sent it to his ex-girlfriend and a bunch of other famous poker players who would have to be sitting across the table from him in the near future, no doubt with that image burned into their head every time they made eye contact with him. The poker star went to the authorities, which he should have done right from the start. And eventually the FBI tracked down these extortionists and arrested them. They made some efforts to cover their tracks, but they weren't real good at it. They had written communications, they sent him emails and stuff, and there were actually 2 people involved, which is never a good sign if you're a criminal. You know what? I don't mean to advise criminals, but if you're going to commit some crime, I suggest sticking it out by yourself, because as soon as you involve somebody else, well, you're just more than doubling your chances of something going wrong. And sure enough, that's what happened with these two extortionists, and they were like texting back and forth, and after they got arrested, they tried to blame each other, so it just caused everything to collapse. However, it wasn't like they murdered somebody, so the judge freed them on bail, and you know what those guys did? They immediately went out and they used the same techniques to gather the passwords of other poker stars, and then they stole thousands and thousands from their poker accounts. Anyway, so the point I'd like to make here is there was a confidentiality compromise. This guy's password got out, and there were very real consequences to it. Terribly embarrassing photos were published of him. He had the right to privacy. Those photos were also confidential. He probably had other confidential information in his email. Certainly all of us send private information in emails that we wouldn't want some stranger who figured out our dog's name to see them, right? So it was personally embarrassing for him. The later thefts where they stole thousands of dollars cost somebody some money. No doubt they took the money and spent it and will be unable to repay it. I don't know if it's going to be the credit card companies or the poker companies who are managing the online websites that the money was stolen from who will end up eating the losses, but somebody's eating those losses and it cost a lot. Now let's talk about integrity. And this isn't the personal kind of integrity, this is data integrity. Data integrity is just deciding who is allowed to change the data and not letting anybody else update it. While confidentiality involves reading the data, integrity really involves writing the data. Integrity is also verifying that the data hasn't been modified in transit, and when legitimate changes are made, being able to audit those changes so you know exactly who changed it and when. I also like to be able to include the ability to roll back earlier versions under the umbrella of data integrity. How do we enforce integrity? Well, just like confidentiality, we use permissions. We also use cryptography. We use hashing and digital signatures. Hashes are small bits of code that represent some bigger piece of data uniquely and irreversibly. Digital signatures use cryptography to sign a piece of data using a private certificate that can't be easily forged but can be easily verified. Now, back in the olden days before computers, we would use wax seals. Now, I'm not quite that old, but you've seen it in movies. They'd make an envelope and they'd pour some wax over it, and then they'd have that big old ring that has like a unique seal on it, and they'd push it in there and it would make an imprint. So this is not enforcing confidentiality, because anybody could come along and tear the envelope open and see the contents of it, right? That wax seal is enforcing integrity, because you can be confident that the letter is not going to be changed, because to change it, somebody would have to break that seal, and then you would be aware that somebody might have changed it. This is what's known as tamper-evident packaging. Tamper-evident packaging enforces integrity by just showing the world that somebody broke the seal and that you can no longer trust the data. You see this in medicine a lot. If you buy a painkiller off the shelf, it'll have tamper-evident packaging. Of course, they can't seal it to prevent everybody from getting in because the consumer has to be able to get into it. So the next best thing is to seal it in such a way that you can tell it's been opened. And if you look at your bottle and it's been opened, well, you're not going to take those pills, right? Because you don't know what somebody put into it. The integrity of those pills has been compromised. Now let's move on to that third leg of the triad, availability. Availability is just keeping your data and services online. It's not as easy as it sounds though, right? We all know that stuff fails, so availability is a real challenge. Now, some people think availability doesn't really sound like security, because we all imagine security as, you know, stopping attackers and keeping secrets and stuff, but SOCP considers availability to be part of the security spectrum, so you have to learn about redundancy techniques and how to keep things running. Another aspect of availability is restoring your data after a hard drive failure, or restoring services to operation after some other equipment failure or a natural disaster. So because availability is considered part of security, business continuance and disaster recovery also become part of security. Scalability also becomes part of security under the availability umbrella, because if a website fails because it's getting too many requests, well, it's not available. Therefore, as a security engineer, you need to know how to keep a web server safe, keep the confidential data on it private, keep the integrity solid by not allowing people to modify the data on it, but also to keep it running through both redundancy, to keep it running in the event of a failure, and scalability, to keep it running in the event of very high demand. High scalability also helps fight denial of service attacks. So once you think about denial of service attacks, availability starts to sound a little more security oriented, right? How do we provide availability? Well, first we just test things to make sure that they're reliable and they're not going to break all the time. We evaluate products and choose the most reliable products we can. We often implement redundancy. We'll put 2 hard drives into a computer instead of 1. That way, when one of those hard drives fails, the other one can just take over and there's no failure. We'll fight off things that might cause a failure, like malware can cause computers to fail. So we'll put anti-malware on a computer. That's helping out the availability. When you think of services that people offer, we'll offer service level guarantees. So if you host your website with a company, a service level guarantee will say, hey, we're going to try to keep this server online except for 15 minutes a year. If it's offline for more than 15 minutes, well, we can't go back in time and fix that, but we'll give you a big wad of money that'll make you feel better about it. That service level guarantee, which usually has some sort of fee attached to it, will also motivate the company to keep your web server online because they're going to be paying out of pocket if they fail, right? Backups are a key part of availability because they help bring things back online, therefore reducing downtime. And along the same lines, disaster recovery plans, which is an organized process to follow in the event of a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood, and business continuity plans, which keep things running in the event of some other type of disaster. So disaster recovery, get your data back online after a serious incident. Business continuity might kick in just after a power outage, getting the most critical services up and running, and often leaving less critical servers offline. Let's talk about a real-world availability compromise. This one is really cool. I think it's pronounced Stuxnet. I'm going to go with that. This is a software-based worm that was discovered in June of 2010. It was basically Windows malware that could spread from one computer to another. Now, when the security people found this malware in the wild on the internet, it was really interesting. The security guys at these anti-malware companies, they look at tens of thousands of pieces of malware every day. That's how many new pieces of malware are made. It's this constant stream. But this one stood out. It was big and it was complex. And in fact, it was so complicated that these security guys said, a hacker didn't make this. This was made by a state. And I don't mean like a state in the United States. I mean like a governmental state, a country basically. And after some further research, the current belief is that Stuxnet was designed by the US and Israel militaries, basically specialized divisions of the militaries who do IT type work, cyber warfare in other words. This is real, June of 2010. So this Stuxnet was a Windows piece of malware that would spread from one Windows computer to another. But it wasn't just released into the public internet. It was specifically targeted to PCs in Iran. And in fact, when it did start to spread on the internet, it was pretty well localized to Iran. We now believe that the goal of Stuxnet was to infiltrate the Iranian nuclear program. They were going into the process of uranium enrichment, which is kind of the first step of, well, could be building a nuclear facility to create power, or it could be creating nuclear weapons. And I think I'm going to go out on a limb here. The US and Israel governments didn't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Can't imagine why, right? So they wrote this piece of malware and distributed it to some computers that presumably were close to the Iranian nuclear program. It wasn't just a Windows piece of malware, though. It had a payload that could infect this manufacturing equipment that managed a centrifuge. If you don't know, a centrifuge is this piece of equipment that spins really fast, and I don't know, maybe it's got uranium in there or something, but that fast spinning helps to separate chemicals into individual substances. Well, this malware carried a payload that can infect the firmware of this equipment. It was manufactured by Siemens and took advantage of a vulnerability in the equipment. It infected the firmware, and then I don't know the specific details of it, but made it spin so fast that it broke it. And sure enough, the president of Iran, who initially denied that this existed at all, did come back and say that Stuxnet caused a outage and slowed down their uranium enrichment program. The UN, who monitors Iran's nuclear program, determined that they had basically stopped development for some period of time. And the idea is that this piece of government-created malware was responsible for that. Here's another availability compromise in the news. This one's pretty recent and it burned people pretty bad. This is Electronic Arts' release of the game SimCity. If you're not familiar with SimCity, it's a game that just simulates running a whole city. You're basically like the mayor of the city and you zone blocks as residential or business oriented, and it historically has been really popular. It's been through like a dozen different versions. They released this new version and it required a connection to the Electronic Arts servers. Now, of course, they did some testing. It worked. They tested it with thousands of different people and they could all connect to the servers and the game worked fine. But then release day came, and you know what? A lot of people wanted to play SimCity. It was a really popular game back in the day and people were excited about it, and they all bought it on release day, installed it, and tried to run it. And EA's servers were not up to the task. It failed. It failed miserably. And just some evidence of how bad it failed, I provided a screenshot of the reviews for the game. That's right, they have over 2,000 one-star reviews. I have a few books on Amazon, and well, I'll just say that seeing those types of reviews would hurt a lot. Nobody's ever going to buy that with those types of reviews. So that's devastating to the company. It would cost them millions and millions and millions of dollars. The chart on the right is their stock chart. So you can see how the value of the company changed the day that SimCity was released. You can see it plummeted. That bar at the bottom of the stock chart shows the number of transactions. So EA was traded like crazy after this particular problem, and their stock value plummeted. So it's difficult to calculate exactly how much it cost EA, but certainly tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. And a good, well-trained security guy would have done some additional load testing and made sure that the servers were set up better, or maybe he would have worked with the developers to make sure that the load on the servers from each individual client was less. Anyway, this could have been prevented, and it wasn't. Now let's talk about privacy. Privacy is not quite the same thing as confidentiality. You know, if it were me, I would just put privacy into confidentiality, but they often treat it as a separate term, so I want you to be familiar with it. Privacy is technically keeping personally identifiable information, PII, secret, confidential. So whereas confidentiality might cover any type of data, privacy is specific to personally identifiable information, and often it's information that hadn't previously been considered confidential. Things like people's names and email addresses, that's personally identifiable, and it needs to be protected. Not necessarily the corporate secrets that you're normally trying to protect, but if you have a list of customers, well, you need to consider that confidential because you have to protect your customers' privacy. The key to privacy is basically complying with privacy regulations. Now, if you are in an industry that's regulated, for example, if you work at a healthcare industry and you're regulated by the United States government's HIPAA regulations, well, you'd better read that code really carefully because it tells you what you can and can't do with personally identifiable information. If you're not in an industry that's regulated, your organization needs to write up privacy policies showing exactly how you protect both employee data and customer data. And then you need to follow those policies. So how do we provide privacy? Well, first we use all the same techniques that we do for confidentiality, including encryption. We also write up privacy policies and we live by them. And finally, we train our users because a lot of private data isn't considered confidential. For example, if you work at an organization, you can probably access the list of customers for the organization. Certainly, every salesperson would need to know who at a particular company to contact if they wanted to make a call. So that data is not necessarily considered confidential, but it still needs to be treated as private. So if you have data like that that everybody can access, well, the only thing you can do is to train the individuals to keep a lid on it. Obviously, you can't use access control to protect data that everybody needs to access, so you need to reach a little farther out to another endpoint, the human being, and tell them, don't tell other people, our customers' email addresses. Let's talk about a rather famous privacy compromise in the news. This is the April 2011 PlayStation Network hack. Now, PlayStation has this big network where everybody can connect to play online games, and it's used by millions and millions of people, including some friends of mine. I've used it a time or two too. Well, around about April 19th, it happened over a period of a week or so, but personal details from 77 million accounts were stolen. Some hackers hacked into the PlayStation network and they got into their confidential data, into their private data, and they stole a lot of PII, including 12,000 credit card numbers. Yes, the PlayStation network was storing some credit card numbers unencrypted on their database. And clearly they didn't have their systems hardened enough because somebody got to them. Big chunk of them were published on the internet. Some of the PII was published on the internet too. So Sony responded to this. I think they responded to it in the right way. They pulled the plug. They were just like, oh no. They shoulder rolled into the data center and just unplugged the whole thing from the wall. They took it offline for 24 days. People were upset. They wanted to be able to play their video games. And you know what? They wanted to shoot people and call them rude names in their headset microphones and say awful things to them. And they were deprived of that fundamental pleasure of life for a period of 24 days, and they were really upset. Sony, their reputation was tarnished severely. They had to admit that personal data was stored on their databases and not encrypted in any way, and obviously their servers simply weren't hardened enough. And under scrutiny from the US government, Sony came out and said that the outage cost them $171 million. So what was the cost of their lack of hardening and their lack of protection for their users' privacy? $171 million. That's a lot of money. I mean, maybe $171 million is pocket change to you, but to me, it's a sizable amount of money. And if I had $171 million to lose, well, I'd probably throw a few bucks at security to protect those assets a little bit better. Security concept number 5, the last one up, is authenticity. What is authenticity? It's knowing who's involved in a transaction. Basically, this is tied closely to authentication. Look, they even have the same word in them. Authenticity is preventing impersonation, so it's knowing who is accessing something and being pretty confident that it's not somebody else who's stolen their username and password. How do we provide authenticity? Well, authentication usually. Sometimes we use multi-factor authentication, biometrics plus a PIN, for example. By using a public key infrastructure, PKI, you can issue private keys to users, and they can use those private keys to digitally sign a document. You just add a little code into the file's metadata, and anybody can retrieve the public key and verify that the document was indeed signed by the holder of that private key. And in fact, it's also a good way to verify the integrity of the file because you can attach a hash in there and make sure that the file hasn't been modified. Let's talk about a really cool authenticity compromise in the news. These are some hotel key cards that got hacked. So on July 3rd, 2012, master hacker Cody Brocious, guessing at how to pronounce his name, he's a coder who works for, I think, Netscape or Mozilla. He created this $50 piece of custom hardware that connects to a proprietary pin in these electronic door locks that hotels use, specifically those locks manufactured by a company called Onity. He announced this at the aptly named Black Hat Hacker Conference, and people thought it was pretty cool. You know why? Because there were about 4 million of those locks in hotels around the world. You know why else? Because people keep expensive stuff in their hotel rooms and they just leave it there. Therefore, you could use this device to get into 4 million hotel rooms and do what you want. So after this comes out, Onity suggests some countermeasures for these 4 million doors. The first is they want you to take some gum and cram it in there. It's not literally chewing gum, it's a more secure epoxy, but basically they just want to add a physical barrier. Another countermeasure they suggested is there's a little panel that you have to unscrew to get to this port, and they wanted you to replace the screws with more obscure heads. So I guess instead of a Phillips screwdriver, you'd have to use some other type of screwdriver. And the third countermeasure they suggested was to physically open up all these door locks and replace the motherboard in them. If you can just imagine, they'd have to manufacture new motherboards, they'd have to ship them out, people would have to disassemble every door lock, and that's difficult because it's a door lock, right? It's supposed to be secure, and then replace the motherboard. So that's unbelievably expensive to do. So Hyatt has a bunch of these locks, and they don't do anything right away. Maybe they're working on it, I don't know. But come September 7th, 2012, Matthew Allen Cook was arrested for stealing a laptop, among other valuables, from a hotel room. He basically used the little device that Cody Brocious invented, plugged it into a hotel room door during a conference, and stole a gal's laptop. Then he went to a pawn shop and sold it. This gal noticed her laptop missing, and she was quite upset, so she went to police, and they managed to find it in the pawn shop. They talked to the pawn shop owner, they went through videotape, they were able to find a video of the guy selling a laptop, they identified him, and they chased him down and arrested him. So this became pretty big news, and the fact that there was a known exploit to this known vulnerability, and Onity and Hyatt hadn't managed to patch it yet, well, this severely damaged their reputation. If you can imagine, if you make door locks, this is the worst thing that can happen to you. I can't even believe that they're still in business, but I guess they have to stay in business because they now have a new business of updating all the locks that they had sold previously, right? Well, as of November 30th, that was the most recent update I could find. Onity had supplied these plugs, this epoxy, for about 1.4 million of the existing 4 million locks. So I would be willing to bet that there are still lots of locks out there that aren't protected. Now, you're not a black hat hacker, so I'm not worried about you breaking into it, but if you do travel, don't trust those door locks. Put your valuables in a safe. And you know what else? When you're in there, throw that extra deadbolt, because that deadbolt generally can't be bypassed by the security code. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.